From the title of this video, I think it's pretty apparent that we're going to be talking about the Scarlet Rot. Maybe even mention a little bit about Melania, although we did talk a lot about her in the last video. But of course, before we get into this, make sure to go and support Vaati. Link to the original video is at the top of the description, as always.
The Scarlet Rot is one of the deadliest things in the lands between, for it has no real cure, and famously, even the demigods could not stave off its effects. I guess no one told them about preserving boluses, huh? Anyway.
Preserving boluses? I'm assuming that's an in-game item that can maybe help you get rid of Scarlet Rot. I don't know if this is accurate, but I think whenever you wander into Caelid, which is that, I'm pretty sure that's the name of the area that's like a swamp full of Scarlet Rot, there's a meter that starts going, and then if that meter fills up, you just kind of die from the Scarlet Rot. So that's just what I'm assuming from somebody who's never played the game before.
What's really interesting about the Scarlet Rot is that it's actually a very old legend, one that predates Melania and all of the horrors found in Caelid. And so, to understand where it all began, we have to go below, to the Lake of Rot, where we can find a few item descriptions that speak of this time. For example, here in the southeastern corner, we can loot a crown of mushrooms that forms this towering headpiece, and it reads, "Long ago, great lords served the Scarlet Rot. Perhaps such fungal bodies served as their crowns." And the rest of this set is made up of the mushroom set, which are considered holy vestments for those enraptured by the Scarlet Rot that root them to the earth. So already we have this hierarchy of mushroom lords that served the Scarlet Rot back then, as well as worshippers who venerated it. And you might think it's strange that these beings might worship or serve a sickness, but the Scarlet Rot is so much more than that.
Although, I mean, what can I even say? In Warhammer, there are plenty of Nurgle worshippers, and I understand the reasoning behind that. Maybe there's a similar reason as to why they worship the Scarlet Rot here?
Because the Scarlet Rot is no mere disease. No, for proof of that, one only need look at the Crystallian. Crystallian are inorganic beings, and yet they can be afflicted by the rot just like any other. There's even some Crystallians that are infused with rot and can spread it to others as well. Because it's not really just a disease. Instead, the map for the Lake of Rot calls it the divine essence of an outer god, something that was sealed away long ago in this underground world.
Everything's an outer god.
And if you've been following Elden Ring lore for any length of time, you should be no stranger to the concept of an outer god. They are these indeterminable, abstract beings that impress an order or a will upon the world through their avatars, their servants, and their vessels. And in the case of the Scarlet Rot, its order is one of decay, where beings are put into a progressing state of death with the intent to achieve this glorious rebirth that will follow that process. The poison armament description tells us this, saying that those who dwell within poison know rot all too well, the death that begets life, that comes to all equally. That is to say, it is the cycle of rebirth put into practice. A great example of this is Miquella's Haligtree, which...
So, I mean, it kind of is in a similar fashion to Nurgle, where it's disease, sickness, rot, decay, but it's also of life. Although it's probably, the main difference here is the rebirth aspect.
Might be completely dead were it not for the fungal growths that have sprouted upon the tree. And of course we also see this in Caelid, where flowers of the rot are on the very precipice of budding, despite all the decay. Of course, it's debatable whether this type of life is even desirable at all, but you can't argue that it is life, and the agents of the rot god certainly find it desirable, so they do their utmost to spark this sacred cycle of rebirth in others, infecting them with poison and rot, and putting this cycle of rebirth into practice. On that note, there is one extremely curious item that you can find down in the Grand Cloister, and it's called the Scorpion Stinger. This is a dagger that's glistening with scarlet rot, and it's...
Oh, it literally does look like a scorpion stinger. That's kind of disgusting.
called a ceremonial tool, which I think means that any ceremony that used this dagger would
It's
have been a
some sort of
ceremony to
sacrificial-
stab and infect another being with the scarlet rot. It would have been a ceremony of spreading their treasured
Rebirth.
affliction to others. But what's really interesting about this dagger is that it's fashioned from a great scorpion's tail, and it's also specifically said to have been crafted from the relic of a sealed outer god.
So, are you saying that the relic of the sealed outer god was just a giant scorpion? Or maybe the outer god kind of resembles the shape of a scorpion?
And when you consider that phrasing, it makes you realize that it's saying that this dagger was fashioned from a relic of the rot god, who was also a great scorpion. That's what it sounds like it's saying. Anyway, I mean, many historical relics in our history are often the physical remains of deceased saints or holy persons, so the god of rot might really
True.
be, or at least might have manifested as, a great scorpion. So I guess this scorpion stinger is kind of like the
But why a scorpion? I don't really attribute scorpion to rot, but I guess I attribute it to poison. So in a way that's kind of adjacent, or depending, kind of the same thing. We did mention poison before here, but I mean, you gotta know that this is Elden Ring. If it did manifest as a giant scorpion, definitely did look like any normal scorpion out there.
Eye of the Fell God, or the Three Fingers of Frenzy, or the whole winged theme that death has going on. It's a small remaining hint at the visual identity of these ephemeral outer
has the
gods
hair on it.
that is intended to stimulate the imagination, even if we never truly find out what these outer gods look like. And whatever rot truly is, it and its scarlet rot essence was eventually conquered, or sealed at least. This was done by a legendary figure known as the Blind Swordsman. As the story goes, the blind
Wait, we've heard the story of the blind swordsman before. Isn't this the person who taught Melania the technique that is nigh impossible to dodge?
Swordsman was favored by a fairy called the Dancer in Blue. The fairy bestowed upon them a flowing curved sword, which was patterned after flowing water, and with this sword the blind swordsman sealed away an ancient god, a god that was rot itself. There's quite a bit to unpack in these descriptions. First, who or what was the fairy called the Blue Dancer? Well, I think that the warrior's blue cloth set gives us a clue. It reveals that the blue color of its fabric symbolizes brisk waters, and the cloth doll that represents the Blue
does look
Dancer
like waves.
is styled to look just like water. The description goes on to say that just as still waters turn foul, stagnation leads to decay. So, warriors must remain ever drifting.
Be like water. Thinking about Melania's move, it does somewhat imitate like flowing water. Very violently flowing water, I might add, but it is very graceful in that way.
It's essentially saying that flowing water is the very antithesis to rot, which thrives in stagnant water.
On stagnation.
And I think, and this is just speculation, but I think that the Blue Fairy might essentially be a sort of river spirit. If you've ever seen Hayao
make sense.
Miyazaki's Spirited Away,
We have.
then you might
Such a
know
good
what
movie.
type of being I'm talking about. In that movie, just quickly, a stinking sludge monster comes to the bathhouse, where it is eventually revealed that it's actually a river spirit whose river was bogged down and corrupted by pollution. But once his waters are unblocked, the river spirit is restored. And Elden Ring, by comparison, does also have two legendary rivers called the Shifra and the Ainzel, which just so happened to flow underground next to and around the scarlet rot that was eventually sealed all that time ago. So I don't think that it's a stretch to think that the Blue Fairy might have occupied or might have been a supernatural extension of those underground rivers. I think it's a fun theory, and I think it helps to explain the Blue Fairy's relationship with water and why it might be a natural enemy of the Rot God. So, the Blue Fairy gave the blind swordsman
Logic
a
tracks.
flowing sword, and he fought with the power of flowing water to seal away the Rot God. But
Dude, the style is so cool. As I said, yeah, it really does remind you of flowing water with how fluid the motions are, and like the movement never really stops, it just transfers.
What's unclear here is how exactly the Scarlet Rot God was sealed away by the blind swordsman. Did he, sword in hand, battle a great scorpion boss in one-on-one combat and just seal its essence away? Or was their battle more of an abstract one, where the Eternal City dams were built and rivers were rerouted to encircle the rot and contain it underground, or something?
My theory is that it was a quick time event.
Like that. These details are left to your imagination, but one way or another, the Scarlet Rot God was sealed away, but it was not defeated, and eventually it would return. And this time, it would do so in an Empyrean vessel, corrupting Melania, a demigod, at the very moment of her birth. Like her brother Miquella, Melania was born an Empyrean. Empyrean meaning she was essentially a valid candidate to replace Queen Marika as a god, and as such it seems she was a ripe candidate for an outer god's meddling. And it's unclear how the Rot God afflicted Melania as soon as she was born, but it did, and that's a shame, because Melania's Great Rune does state that it should have been the most sacred Great Rune of them all, were it not for what I assume was the Rot God's meddling.
Do we have no protection from any of these outer gods, just messing with Empyreans? Is it just all to the whims of the gods now at this point? Well, he did say that it was unclear, so maybe even the methods are just completely unknown. All that we know is that it happened, and she suffered from it.
And speaking of great runes, in the sister video to this one, we talk about how Miquella was essentially the flip side to Melania in many ways, especially in cut content where the twins were born of an inseparable fate and said to hold the runes of both abundance and decay between them. And to reflect this duality, it seems, Miquella is in this constant state of overflowing abundance, while Melania was in this constant state of overflowing death, essentially. We sort of see this tragedy unfolding in a few statues of Melania, since you can see back then she did actually have all her limbs once upon a time, until the rot continued to take hold, moving her inexorably towards her inevitable death and rebirth as well. And that must have felt inevitable, for it seems like in these early days there were few known ways to ward off the rot. Fire was probably the obvious one, and then there was also the act of consecration, which was used, which is essentially the act of declaring something as sacred, which was done to the weaponry of Melania and her knights, and apparently it helped their armaments, at least, to resist the rot. But their flesh was still susceptible. Melania's knights were therefore called the Clean Rot Knights, and they vowed to fight alongside Melania despite the inevitable, if gradual, putrefaction of their flesh. And it was this fact that made these warriors so fierce, for they had basically already accepted their terrible fate, and so logically they had nothing else to lose in battle.
It is incredibly scary to fight somebody who is not afraid of death. Not that I would know, of course, thankfully. We do live in a time where it's not commonplace.
Knights were bestowed the winged sword insignia, given only to those who fought alongside Melania the Severed. Interestingly, this is the only item that gives Melania the title the Severed. I assume that it's referencing a time where Melania was known for her prowess despite her fragmented body, as it's called in the Japanese. And
makes sense.
I guess it's possible that she wasn't yet known as the Blade of Miquella at the time, though that's just my own speculation.
The Blade of Miquella thing is just kind of known to us because she just keeps on repeating it over and over and over whenever you keep on dying to her boss battle.
At any rate, Melania Blade of Miquella is her most common title, and it's easy to see why she would dedicate herself to her brother so fully. For her brother was so dismayed by her condition that he dedicated himself to finding a treatment for the rot. And this search for a cure dramatically affected Miquella's worldview. For instance, he was formerly a faithful fundamentalist of the Golden Order, with all the magic to boot,
that wouldn't work.
he would abandon those practices as they could do nothing to treat his sister's accursed rot. Instead, he pursued a path of unalloyed gold, and he crafted for Melania a needle that could be inserted into her flesh, granting relief from the rot and preventing the progression of the rotting sickness. If you're interested in why unalloyed gold was able to do this and work that way, then I'd recommend you check out this video afterwards, which talks at length about Mikola. But we learn about the needle's specific effects in-game when we give it to a character called Millicent, who is also suffering from the Scarlet Rot. Millicent is this great parallel to Melania that teaches us so much about what Melania might have felt or experienced. So Millicent too has lost a limb, and she is also...
That's kind of important, because otherwise you don't really get to have a moment of conversation with Melania herself. I kind of wish you did. Considering the circumstances, and especially if you had found Mikola at Moog's palace beforehand, maybe you could like tell her, at least, you know, stop her from immediately killing you. Although, to be fair, you did kind of like break into her home, killed all of the guards, and then managed to get into the one sacred place where she doesn't want anyone to be, so there is that aspect to it as well.
So losing her memories, and when we find her, she is unable to even move. But as soon as we give her the needle, she's able to function and fight once more. Therefore, it's fair to assume that similar benefits were conferred upon Melania when her brother gave her the needle. It's also worth noting that the multiple needles that we find in-game, they aren't finished. Even the final version of this needle can only be used in the storm beyond time at Farum Azula, where it allows you to cheat fate, essentially. And that makes sense here, because you're...
Why? You can only use it in this specific place? Storm beyond time?
You're outside of time in this place, so maybe you can prevent these afflictions from the outer gods before they even happen. So perhaps if Mikola had been able to imbue his needle with some time warping capabilities, he could have eventually undone the effects of the rot god entirely, but again...
Oh, I suppose that is one way to counter the meddling of an outer god. Create a needle so powerful that it literally reverses time for that person to a point before the outer god's influence, so like even then the outer god wouldn't be able to do anything because of that. And yeah, that's why you can only do it or use it in this place that's outside of time. Okay, gotcha.
The needle was unfortunately never finished. The needle isn't all that Mikola created with unalloyed gold. He also crafted for his sister a prosthetic arm, leg, helmet, and armor of unalloyed gold, which, again, like Millicent, surely allowed her to overcome her one-armed shortcoming and reach for newer heights as a fighter. So Melania's prospects were already looking up, but things didn't end there, for Melania would go on to meet a man who would become her mentor, and he would give her this final, invaluable tool that could be employed against the Scarlet Rot. We see their meeting play out on this image of the prosthesis wearer heirloom, which depicts a scene from a heroic tale. You can even see Melania's prosthetic arm and leg in this image if you look closely, which is why I assume that this meeting took place after Mikola's intervention with all of the unalloyed gold prosthetics. So her mentor was, as you might have guessed, the blind swordsman, the man who first sealed away the rot all those years ago, the very same. And after encountering her mentor and his flowing blade, she gained wings of unparalleled strength. This meeting says a lot about the blind swordsman. He must have known that Melania was basically inhabited by his ancient enemy, and yet he doesn't attempt to kill her here. Instead, he takes her under his wing and teaches her the techniques that he himself once used to curtail the rot in the first.
Actual anime sensei right here. But that also makes sense for his character and his technique and everything that he's kind of about. To flow like water. Even if that was his mortal enemy residing within the body of Melania, that doesn't mean Melania was a part of this conflict to begin with. So yeah, it makes sense for him to teach her techniques to stave it off and to very effectively protect herself and her brother. Good guy, blind swordsman right there.
first place. It's a pretty wise thing to do, and perhaps we shouldn't expect any less from someone who was able to defeat an outer god in the first place. So
this guy's literally like the main protagonist of a story that happened before you even got into the realms between.
That's why the skill on Melania's blade is called the Waterfowl Dance. This is why Melania recovers health by attacking during her boss fight. By moving relentlessly, like flowing water, the damage of the rot was offset, and Melania was able to achieve unparalleled strength and to maintain her pride. But it was that same pride that she would abandon in her fight with Radahn.
We do see this in the opening cinematic where she has to use it because Radahn is just way too damn powerful. And the Scarlet Rod is just so powerful that even Radahn can't hold up against it. An actual demigod.
Radahn was born of Queen Rennala, who was the Queen of Caria, and King Consort Radagon, who was previously a great champion of the Erd Tree. Thus was the Order of the Moon and the Erd Tree conjoined. And while Radahn was a true Carian, and certainly proficient in the art of sorcery, we can see in his character an inclination towards another path,
very much
an aspiration to be like
father.
Godfrey, for example, who was the first Elden Lord, and also his father Radagon, who would become the second Elden Lord. Caria was, after all, a largely matriarchal society, meaning that power was passed down to the princesses in the family. So perhaps it's no surprise that Radahn was not as motivated by his Carian heritage compared to his sister Rani, for instance. So Radahn's set was decorated with a golden lion that symbolized Godfrey and his beast regent, and it states that from his youngest years, Radahn was naturally captivated by the Lord of the Battlefield. Then his golden helmet was designed with his flaming red hair in mind, which Radahn inherited from his father, drawing attention to the fact that he was fond of the heroic implications of being Radagon's son. Radahn and his knights were fittingly known as the Red Mane, which conflates Radahn's red hair with the mane of Godfrey's lion, and Radahn was even quoted as saying, "I was born a champion's cub, now I am the Lord of the Battlefield's lion," which borders on being a statement of complete loyalty to Godfrey and the Golden Order, but we'll get to that debate a little bit later. So, naturally, this was a guy who reveled in the art of warfare, and even in his youth as a Carian royal, it seems Radahn was already a renowned general. We can infer this because of a man named Jeren. The Eccentric's armor specifically says that after spending time as a guest of the Carian royals, he became a guest commander for General Radahn. Therefore, Radahn must have still been in close contact with his Carian family, as Jeren met Radahn through these Carian royals, and when they did meet, Jeren and Radahn seemed to immediately share a certain bond, for despite Jeren preferring to have a nomadic existence, he decided to become a guest commander for General Radahn. And then, despite
something probably clicked between them, like, hey, we vibe. A guest commander, though. Never heard of that term, but I understand what it implies.
The temporary implication of such a title, Jeren, this restless tumbleweed, as he was called, would become bound by honorable oath, and he and Radahn swore a vow of honorable death to one another.
Dang. Literally, like, became bros over I don't know, maybe a beer. Who knows? From what it has been described of Jeren, though, being that nomadic knight just roaming the lands, it would have taken a lot to get him to stay here and earn his respect. Although, to be fair, just seeing Radahn just going around on the battlefield is really enough to earn my respect. Especially his feats with literally like holding back the stars.
Promising that they would die honorably in battle, even if it was death by the other's hand. So it's not stated which battles that Radahn was fighting at the time, nor which war he required a new guest commander for. But then the world is very different at the time, and there's so much of the Lands Between's history that we don't know about. So I guess it's possible that the battles were being fought for distant lands like Limgrave and Caelid. The Limgrave East map does say, after all, that this path here
was trod
by many a soldier in the past. Maybe Radahn's forces took this path as well? And this was before Caelid was even afflicted with the Scarlet Rot, so things might have looked really different here, although admittedly we do have this shot from this trailer that shows that it still kind of looks a bit like a red hellscape here, with the red sky, and this was technically before the Scarlet Rot took hold. Caelid did still have some culture to boast of though. For example, in the very middle of Caelid, there is or was a town of sorcery called Sellia, and despite Radahn's relationship with Caria and Briar Lucaria as well, presumably, it was here in Sellia that he studied, learning gravitational magics that likely could not be taught anywhere else. He did this, as the story goes, all so he would never have to abandon his beloved but scrawny steed.
Yeah, that's the one thing that I know. Like, even before I even got into the Elden Ring lore, everybody was asking, like, why is he riding around this scrawny little horse? It's because it's his beloved steed, but he looks so tired and frail now. Poor guy.
Gravitational magics could relieve the weight of Radahn and allow his scrawny horse to carry him evermore. Also, in case you don't know, the horse's name is Leonard, according to the data, so that is the name that we're going to use going forward.
Leonard.
And what's interesting about Leonard is that he's specifically called out as being scrawny, as if that's the reason why he can't carry Radahn, who is enormous. Shouldn't Radahn's size be the reason why he can't ride his horse? So I think, personally, that Radahn actually didn't become as large as he is for a very long time, and I think there's some good evidence to back that up. For one, his throne in Leyndell is of regular size. Two, his portrait is of a simple grown man, and lastly, we see a brief shot of Radahn fighting in this image where he barely even matches Morgott in size. So personally, I think that Radahn probably only grew in size when he acquired a great rune. Regardless, at this stage anyway, it's clear that Radahn initially learned gravitational magic for the sake of his horse, but that gravitational skill set would certainly come in handy as the years went on. For one, these gravitational magics were passed on to some of his elite soldiers, like Ogre, who was the longest-serving member of the Redmane Knights, who studied techniques to manipulate gravity alongside Radahn. The equipment and the skill sets of the Redmane Knights really were very inspired by Radahn. For example, the surcoat of Radahn's Redmane Knights depicts a red-maned lion raising a sword in the image of Radahn. All of them proved that they were worthy of the Redmane name. Even their great shield's design takes that symbolism further, being shaped like a fang and featuring the crest of a red-maned lion.
Yeah, I was wondering what that shape was like. I'm like, no, not a moon. But yeah, it's a fang.
And these knights were strong, like Radahn too, with descriptions stating that they were reputed to be masterful warriors, and it was popularly said that the Redmanes knew no weakness. But for all of their prowess in battle, a conflict was coming that no military strength could ward away. And I'm not talking about the Scarlet Rot, I'm talking about the stars. But luckily, for this upcoming conflict, Radahn was able to solicit the help of an extremely knowledgeable teacher. According to the Gravity Well sorcery, Radahn's master was an Alabaster Lord with skin of stone, and these Onyx and Alabaster Lords were a different race entirely to humans, and were said to have risen to life when a meteor struck long ago. And the meteorite sorcery tells us that the reason they were called lords was in reverential fear of their destructive power. And it seems like Radahn was soliciting their help because a similarly meteoric destructive power was on its way to Sellia. So earlier we established that he explicitly did learn gravitational magic so that he could ride his horse, but the Collapsing Stars sorcery also explicitly says that he learned gravitational techniques so that he could challenge the stars, which I think suggests that there were two distinct periods of learning here for Radahn. Learning for the sake of his horse, and then learning for the sake of keeping Celia safe. And there's also quite a bit of evidence that suggests that Radahn's...
And then the advanced techniques from stopping literal stars collapsing into the earth. Because I'm pretty sure it's only until after you defeat Radahn that a passageway into the underground gets created by like a meteorite or something falling into the earth.
Actions here were in defense. For example, the sword gravestone in Caelid specifically tells us that Radahn held Celia secure.
Well, but like, if it was originally going to hit Celia and he stopped it, wouldn't its trajectory still go into Celia instead? Unless if something ended up deviating it, or just the fact that it stopped kind of created some sort of kinetic energy. I don't know. That sent it in a different direction.
I wonder why. Anyway, there's one more thing I want to talk about here, and it's that you could also make the argument that Radahn might have intervened at Celia and frozen the stars on behalf of the Golden Order. After all, the telescope item description literally says that the fate once writ in the night skies was fettered by the Golden Order. And Radahn was a fanboy of Radagon and Godfrey, who were two proponents of the Golden Order, so it's definitely possible that he did this on the Golden Order's behalf. Personally, though, I think that both things can be true. I think that Radahn was clearly motivated to defend Celia from Starfall, and I think that the Golden Order did stand to benefit from one of its vassals achieving such a feat. Radahn, and most of the demigods at that stage, for that matter, were technically on the side of Marika's Golden Order. So I guess technically Radahn was aligned with the Golden Order and could have fettered the stars on their behalf. Technically. But the impression that I get from Radahn is that he has no real loyalty to anyone other than himself and his men.
I mean, doesn't he want to be a lord of the battlefield, kind of like Godfrey was? From how he looks like and how I think his character would be, I feel like he trains and then he learns these magics, well, originally for his horse, but he also wants to be the strongest on the battlefield, just like his hero Godfrey was. Which doesn't necessarily mean that he would follow everything the Golden Order bids him to do, nor really anything his family bids him to do. Just the kind of guy to stand tall and protect the things that are personally important to him, like his men, and the place where he learned magic.
This is my speculation, but I think this because he's not really hated by anyone in the current age or anyone in game. Even his brother Rykard has his picture up on the wall, and Rykard famously hated anything to do with the Golden Order.
Rykard is the brother who fed himself to the serpent, right?
So while I think Radahn served the intent of the Golden Order, I don't think he was beholden to it, especially not in the later years when the Elden Ring was shattered, because remember this cutscene with Morgoth?
Willful traitors.
Morgoth labels all of the demigods as traitors to the Golden Order, including Radahn, who we do see in a clash with Morgoth, suggesting that he might have abandoned his loyalty to Order and marched on Leyndell after the shattering, before Radahn, like his demigod kin, had claimed a great rune. And it's easy to assume that a warmonger like him would have had great ambitions for power, and might have even aspired to become Elden Lord. And it's around this time, when the demigods were clashing, that Malenia enters the picture once more. Because Malenia, Blade of Miquella, was marching towards Caelid, past Godric in Limgrave, and towards Radahn.
Honestly, Godric's nothing more than a jumped-up country bumpkin. Lord? Oh, don't make me laugh. First, he hid himself amongst the womenfolk to flee the capital, then hid from Radahn in that castle. Then he insulted Malenia, lost to her in battle, only to lick her boots rather than die like a man.
What the hell?
Has he no shame? The big girl's blouse?
Yo,
this
trash talking.
Kenneth Haidt is a great piece of lore, as it tells us about this crucial late part of the Shattering War. At this point, Godric had just failed to usurp Lanedale capital and had fled with his tail between his legs to Stormvale. Here, he hid in fear of Radahn, who was a close neighbor in Caelid, and it makes sense that he'd fear Radahn, who was considered by many to be the strongest of the demigods. But while he was hiding here, a different army approached. From the north, not the south, as Godric must have feared. Malenia and her Cleanrot knights were passing Stormvale on their southwards march from the Halig Tree to Caelid. And this event, this passing, is marked at the Leonia Highway sword gravestones, which state, "Nothing will hinder the wings of the blade of Mikola and the Cleanrot knights." These gravestones tend to mark points of battle, and Kenneth does state that Godric insulted Malenia and lost to her in battle, so I assume this is where that happened. As to the nature of the insult, well, we have cut dialogue from Godric to help us out here.
Let's see this.
There is only one tree, and only its branches, that bathe in true rays of gold. Not the fool-omened king, nor the rank malformed twins.
So Godric considered Mikola and Malenia rank and malformed.
Oh,
so
God, dude, you gonna say that to her face? You deserve to die. She is Malenia, Blade of Mikola. You can't say that to the Blade of Mikola.
The insult was along those lines, which was not smart on Godric's part. Malenia must have messed him up, but tellingly, she did not kill him. And that's a curious detail, because this was the Shattering War. We're supposed to believe that all of the demigods were fighting for power, but if Malenia was seeking power here and looking for others' great runes to acquire in order to restore the Elden Ring and live up to Mikola or her own Empyrean promise, then you'd think that she would have killed Godric, that she wouldn't have shown him mercy. But instead, she lets him live. So, to me, that suggests that Malenia might not have been on this southward march to take power. Because if she didn't claim Godric's great rune, then she probably wasn't here for Radahn's either. So, why then? Why did Malenia come full force towards Radahn on this southward march? I feel like there are 3 options. 4 if you count the theory that Malenia might have chased down Radahn in order to get control of the Elden Ring, but as I've just explained, I feel like that's unlikely. Option 2, although it's still unlikely in my opinion, is that Malenia might have sought out Radahn simply for the sake of fighting him. He was, after all, widely considered the mightiest of the demigods, as was Malenia in many cases. So it's not ridiculous to think that both of them might have fought simply for the sake of pitting their strength against one another.
Maybe, but
that's a
I don't
pretty
think
unsatisfactory answer, in my opinion. Option 3, I feel, could be because Malenia was looking for her brother. At this point, Mikola could have already been stolen away by Mohg, so perhaps she was simply looking for him. She pretty intentionally makes a beeline towards the south and towards Caelid, and Mohg's palace is essentially underneath Celia and underneath the area where Radahn and Malenia fought, so I guess it's possible that Malenia had some intel leading her here.
Maybe some intel, some sort of sense, who knows? But like, maybe somebody put it in that direction and it just so happened to be Radahn was there above ground. This does seem a lot more plausible though, because as Vaati mentioned, she didn't grab the Great Rune. She was just there on a very specific mission, and Malenia is very motivated whenever it's something to do with Mikola.
A search for Mikola, but again, this is only speculation. But my favorite theory is the 4th one, which is that Malenia, and by extension Mikola, may have wanted Radahn dead for the same reason that Rani eventually does, so that the stars could resume their movement, bringing certain fates back into play. And you might be asking, but why would Mikola want the stars to resume their movement? Well, perhaps Mikola's own fate was locked in stasis. We do find a demigod's Starlight Shard in Mikola's hideaway, after all, and I feel like it should be concerning that his fate might have fallen like this. But the best answer, I think, is that Mikola wanted the stars back in motion so that the moon could properly eclipse the sun. Okay,
then it ties back into this, where they were potentially trying to resurrect the other demigod that ended up dying. What was his name again? Vati will probably mention it here. Apologies, there's so many things going on.
It was a ritual that Mikola seemed to believe would revive Godwyn the Golden, his brother.
Godwyn.
And
There
we
it
talk
is.
about this a lot more in this video, and I can definitely see how the stars being in stasis would prevent the moon from eclipsing the sun, so I really like this answer. But
That is a good answer,
theories.
yeah.
Surely there's more than just these 4 options. But in the end, there's only really one answer that I'm confident in, and it's that we can't confidently say for sure why Melania fought Radahn. Not yet, anyway. But whatever the reason, it must have been a good one, because it was during this battle that Melania sacrificed everything.
Yeah. Voice crack. She had to release the Scarlet Rot.
There is something I must return to Melania. The will that was once her own. The dignity. The sense of self that allowed her to resist the call of the Scarlet Rot. The pride she abandoned to meet Radahn's measure.
In Elden Ring's story trailers, we see this legendary fight play out. Cleanrot Knights finally arrive with Melania, facing off against the Redmane Knights, and manage to plunge a ton of spears into Radahn during their clash. You can actually see these spears still sticking out of his back to this day.
Dang.
Then
He
Melania
doesn't
and
take
Radahn
him
are
out?
here to be the only 2 left standing. Melania sacrifices her prosthetic arm to get close to Radahn, grabbing her blade and plunging it into both of them, giving us a close-up view of the 2 characters. Here, Radahn looks monstrous, which I theorize could again be because he's tainted with the madness of a great rune, though that is just speculation. And we can also see Melania's lips moving here, muttering some final words, or perhaps the incantation for the Scarlet Aeonia, which envelops herself and Radahn, putting an end to their fight. In this video's first chapter, we talked extensively about Melania's battle against the Scarlet Rot within her, but in this moment, she seems to lose that fight, maybe intentionally, and she allows the Scarlet Rot to take hold. Millicent,
in order to
who is
meet
a great
Radahn the
parallel
Measure.
to Melania, says that this is when she sacrificed her dignity, her sense of self, her will, and her pride. Melania did all of this just so that she could meet Radahn's measure. Thus did the Scarlet Rot explode outwards, infecting Radahn and the very land itself, as their battle came to a horrific standstill. In the end, neither party was in a state to continue fighting, so technically Melania didn't lose, so she was technically still undefeated. Few survived the Battle
there
of
you go.
Aeonia, but one who did was the Cleanrot Knight Finlay, who, in an unimaginable act of heroism, carried the slumbering form of Melania all the way back to the Halig Tree. They managed
Holy.
this alone, fending off all manner of foes along the way.
Jesus!
But back at the center
What
of
a
Caelid,
journey.
Melania's scarlet bloom remained. A nearby phantom's dialogue reads,
Actual
"Sublime,
MVP.
I tell you, the very first flower of Aeonia bloomed on this very spot. Melania, may you blossom into a goddess." In the present day, Caelid features at its center a
Not a
giant
goddess that she
tree
wanted to be.
that spirals in a similar manner to Melania's first scarlet bloom, so it probably is the same scarlet bloom. As the Phantom says, this was the very first flower of Aeonia, and the beginning of the Scarlet Swamp in this land. And at the very center of that is another curious thing. There's a boss called Commander O'Neill, who carries the Commander's Standard, which reads, "Even after his lord was fled, Commander O'Neill continued to brandish this flag in the devastation of the rot-eaten field of battle. The sole veteran who remembers this battle
He
with
was
pride."
there
And it's
during
hard
the
for me to
battle.
say exactly whose side
Melania, right?
O'Neill would have been on. He summons the spirits of exiled soldiers, who themselves have no real affiliation to speak of, though I will say that you can summon one of Millicent's sisters to help you in the fight against O'Neill, which might suggest that he's opposed to the idea of rot and that he might have fought for Radahn, although I feel like you could go both ways on this, because the Commander's Standard says that his lord was fled, and both Melania and Radahn fled this battle.
Fled, yeah,
Anyway,
so-
when you defeat O'Neill, by luring him into the guises of scarlet rot because it's funny, he doesn't just drop the
Well, there you go. That's a big brain moment, using the environment to your advantage. And man hates the rod anyway, so makes sense. If there's any more evidence suggesting who this O'Neill guy was on the side of that you guys know of, please let me know. I'm just gonna throw a guess out there and say it's probably Radon. I don't know, it's just the way he looks, the armor, where he's standing. Yeah, that's what I think.
Commander's standard. He also drops an heirloom of the Battle of Aeonia, a broken needle of unalloyed gold that was once buried within Melania's own flesh, repelling her scarlet rot until it snapped. A really interesting question here, considering the needle is broken, is whether Melania snapped the needle intentionally when she plunged her blade into herself and Radahn. Perhaps she knew that it would cause the rot within her to flare up worse than ever if the needle was broken, and allow her to defeat Radahn. Millicent does explain that the explosion of rot in her is worse after she takes out the needle, almost as if it's been building up inside them all this time.
I paused to even tell you, but I took out the needle myself. The scarlet rot writhes now. Worse than ever.
So it's pretty clear that this is where the final moments of the battle took place, and we even find Clean Rot Knights able to rise outside when you're near, even now. But then we don't find Radahn anywhere near here. Instead, we find him closer to his former home at Redmane Castle. In a nearby catacomb, the spirits of the war dead actually continue to clash, refusing to surrender, even in death. And outside, Radahn is exactly the same way. And while witless, he's still alive, even managing to keep the stars in stasis, even now, for he's still in possession of his great rune, which itself started to burn to resist the encroachment of the scarlet rot. His feet have rotten off, the spears of Clean Rot Knights remain in his flesh, but he fights on, simply using those spears in his back as arrows to fight off anyone who threatens him.
The amount of spears that he has is insane. It's an ungodly amount of spears. Were they all really in his back? How many guys did it take to, like, take him down? Well, obviously Melania did that. Well, not fully, but still. Like, that's a lot of spears.
Refusing to give up and die in anything but an honorable death.
This is a cool shot. That was really good. Everything rotting scarlet.
Are you one for festivals or flowers? To the south, a grand festival to make the stars turn. To the east, the heart and bud of a flower to be. But dare you enter into the heart of the scarlet rot?
As the rot takes hold, Caelid becomes a fresh hell, and the land itself becomes a threat. Even the dragons in this place were forced to flee, and they would make a new nest on a plateau that would be dubbed Dragon Barrow, and no one since then has dared to enter it. That said, a few dragons did not make it away unscathed. The dragon Exekis succumbed to the scarlet rot, though he did not forget his hatred, and sadly, Grail, the mother of all dragons, who dwarfs them all as well, can be found on death's door surrounded by her children, and completely blighted by the scarlet rot. Kind of sad. Thanks for the 50k runes, though. And in the end, it was Melania's scarlet rot, not really Melania herself, that would eventually drive Radahn's Redmane Knights to defeat. According to their armor, when they were driven to defeat by Melania's scarlet rot, the Redmane Knights burned off the crest on the left breast of their armor to indicate their resolve, stating, "Alas, dear home, I shan't see you again, for our duty is to remain here, a bulwark against the blight." The knights using fire to burn away their own crest in this way is such a great symbol, for fire was their one and only weapon for fighting back against the rot, And interestingly, according
Only
to
way to
the
get rid of it.
Armorer's Cookbook, a lot of these tools and techniques to do with fire were passed down by an armorer who served the great General Radahn, as his books contain knowledge of dealing with rot, the application of fire in particular. And so, this flame of the Redmanes clearly became a large part of their identity henceforth.
Well, actually, we did get rid of it through flowing water as well. Kind of the opposite of fire, if you think about it in that way. But that isn't really an option here, because I don't think there's any like flowing river. It's more of like a swamp, right?
Corpses of rabid wildlife were piled high and burned. Long smouldering walls of flame were built in order to prevent the rot from spreading to neighboring lands. These same walls border their own castles. They burnt down churches, and they even managed to commandeer some flame chariots to help in their fight. They utilized torches, firepots, arrows, everything.
Anything.
And fittingly,
that they
Knight
can get.
Jeren's beloved sword, a flamberge, became the symbol of the castle itself, thanks to the flame-like undulation that gives this sword its difficult-to-pronounce name. And Jeren himself remained at Redmane Castle to regularly host a celebration of war, calling champions from far and wide to deliver death. A death for his friend, who is now festering with rot and crippled by madness, who now only wishes for an honorable way out.
Damn. Jaren's a real one, bro. They really did have that deep of a bond with each other.
Meanwhile, amidst Melania's Aeonian butterflies, pale pests emerge from the swamp of Aeonia. And though they appear to be mere bugs, they're not. These creatures are intelligent, with a quote-unquote keen intellect that allows them to craft uncanny weaponry from sharpened shell. They can incant spells as well, and they can even tame wild beasts. That said, they are ultimately creatures of worship, and Gowry actually calls them witless, which admittedly does contrast with them being described as intelligent in this item description. Regardless, the pests are also called the abandoned children of the goddess and servants of the goddess of rot, who have been forsaken. And it's not hard to see why. Not only was Melania carried far away at the very moment of her bloom when these pests allegedly emerged, but she resents and resists the scarlet rot inside her,
So
unless she's
abandoned
pushed
by
to the absolute
Melania.
brink.
Yeah.
So, of course, these pests are abandoned in that sense as well. And who wouldn't hate them, honestly? Is there anything
Right?
more annoying than this bloody attack? Nevertheless, the pests persist. They even have a quotable line of dialogue in the Kindred of Rot's exaltation talisman, which reads, "Rot for the Scarlet Goddess. O scarlet blossoms flourish in..."
Dang. Whatever this thing is, it's creepy, but it also looks really cool. It's in the shape of one of them, just in a circle.
distant lands and return to us the unwanted children, which brings us to the phrase scarlet blossoms. This might not be talking about literal flower buds of the scarlet rot, but instead I think it's talking about actual people. I think it's talking about these 5 sisters. I think these are the scarlet blossoms. They are Pollyanna, Maureen, Amy, Mary, and Millicent.
The girl,
We only meet Millicent.
She is a bud, green and undeveloped, waiting to flower into magnificence. What a wondrous day that will be. In truth, before her, I'd never seen a bud of such superior quality. She might very well outshine her sisters.
So it seems like these pests, including Gowry perhaps, have a keen interest in cultivating these scarlet blossoms. I'd prefer to talk about Millicent's questline in a future Prepare to Cry episode, so subscribe and turn on notifications, but I will hold off for now. But essentially, Gowry does all of this in anticipation of these daughters becoming Scarlet Valkyries, who he believes might one day serve Melania when she ascends as the goddess of rot.
I mean, I was gonna say that they basically like mini Melanias. Wouldn't it be horrific to have everybody, like all the 5 sisters and Melania, and they all just charge up the same move at the same time? That undodgeable one. Oh my god. Literally impossible boss fight.
At this point, Malenia hadn't been seen for a long while, not since she was carried off to the Halig Tree, and the Halig Tree's location itself was a mystery to many. But there were still those who venerated and worshipped her, and they weren't all pests. Some of them were human, like Malie Marai, the Castellan of the Shaded Castle. Malie wears the Marai mask, which is something only worn by the head of House Marai. It bears the likeness of the first of their line, and it describes this long dual history of the Marai family, who served as both executioners and castellans of the Shaded Castle. So fittingly, their storied sword is the Marai Executioner's Sword, a broad-bladed weapon that would eventually be used against them. For one day, they made the mistake of capturing a bell-bearing hunter named Elima. But Elima, who knew battle skills that allowed him to move objects with his very own will, snatched the sword from the site of his looming execution and overthrew his captors. But it doesn't seem like he wanted to rule over the castle in their stead. Instead, the castle falls into ruin, and when we find him, Elima is just standing and staring at an enormous portrait, which is a picture of Malenia, who some believe is to blame for the fate of the castle. A nearby phantom laments the state of things and states, House Marai is ruined, just deserts for falling for that severed harpy. No surprise that guilty cretin took the castle and our storied sword. In the outskirts of the castle, you can actually find and fight Malie Marai, the former castellan of the castle who has now been ousted. He wields the ant spur rapier, which is a weapon that evokes the scorpion dagger.
It kind of does, but I guess you could say that it's like a stinger from an ant or one of their legs.
That we mentioned at the start of the video, as it's also a blade fashioned from a chitinous creature. In this case, it's the spur of a giant ant. Fittingly then, its description reminds us that Scarlet Rot is an old legend, and goes on to state that Malie Marai of the Shaded Castle was a private believer in the Scarlet Rot, and indeed, he eventually found his own personal goddess. The Marai robe explains why he was so enamored with her, stating that the sons of House Marai are all sickly born, and so Malie Marai was beguiled by the beautiful and fierce goddess who was born into rot.
I mean, makes sense. Hey, I mean, don't yuck anyone else's yuck. Malie Marai was into that strong lady. Incredibly strong lady.
Malenia was, after all, a powerful and fierce figure in spite of her affliction, so it's easy to see why Malie Marai looked up to her. Though I guess it's possible that he took this veneration too far, as the castle is found sinking into a poison swamp, and the throne room is filled with prosthetics which mirror Malenia's own. Indeed, it's possible that he even found Malenia's very own prosthetic, as you can loot the Valkyrie's prosthesis here.
Oh my god. Wait, is he actually a stalker? Does Malenia know about this?
Which reads, golden prosthesis once used by the one-armed Valkyrie.
Yeah, that was actually like her old one.
With practice and skill, it can be used as proficiently as a real arm. When Malie Marai, Lord of the Shaded Castle, embraced this prosthesis, he claimed to feel the presence of his personal
Malie Marai actually is like an idol fan. This man.
Goddess. Now, I'm not really sure if this is Malenia's actual prosthesis or not. I feel like you could make debates for and against that, but regardless, it drives home just how much of a fanboy this guy was. But in the end, the castle is not much more now than just a home for some surviving Clean Rot Knights who would understandably feel at home in such a place. And I guess they have nowhere else to go, as Malenia slumbers back at the Halig Tree, where she does very little else until you arrive and trigger what I think is her second transformation.
Here we go.
Wait. The scarlet bloom flowers once more.
You will witness true horror. Now, rot.
Now, I got some bad
Scarlet
news for you
Goddess.
guys in this final chapter. So, you know how difficult Melania was to defeat, right? Well,
Yeah.
what if I told you that wasn't her final form? It might not be, for the Scarlet Aeonia description reads, each time the scarlet flower blooms, Melania's rot advances, and with the third bloom, she will become a true goddess. So,
Oh, God.
it's known that Melania's first bloom was in Caelid.
So you're saying that the second bloom, which happens when we fight her, which is the second phase of that boss fight, isn't even Melania at full power. Melania at full power, the third bloom as a goddess would probably just immediately annihilate you, just insta-kill.
And we know that she blooms in a fight against us, so the debate becomes, is this mid-fight bloom Melania's second
The second
bloom
or the third?
or her third? Some would argue that this is Melania's third bloom, and that she's already become the Goddess of Rot. She does, after all, literally have Goddess of Rot as her title, and there is a bloom right outside her boss room which could have been the site of her second bloom. So how do you argue
Potentially.
against that? Well, for starters, the bloom outside might not be hers. For one, it'd be kind of weird if she had a second bloom that is never described, right here, when she's slumbering in just the neighboring room. But not only that, in front of this bloom, you actually loot the Traveler's set, which is the same set worn by Millicent and her sisters, and Melina as well. Considering Millicent and her sisters are buds of Melania, and
probably
considering
them.
Millicent also leaves behind one of these blooms when she dies, it's not ridiculous to think that one of these sisters might have flowered here already.
Yeah.
And I don't think that Melania having Goddess of Rot in her boss title means that much. Many, like Gowry and the Pests, already believe that Melania is the Goddess of Rot.
I mean, regardless of whether this is her true actual final form or not, she is still technically speaking the Goddess of Rot.
The Scarlet Aeonia description instead specifies that the third bloom will make her a true goddess, and I think anything before that is just a brief flash of the rot god shining through. But the biggest piece of evidence that Melania hasn't yet reached her third bloom yet, in my opinion, comes from Gowry, who goes to extraordinary lengths to nurture Millicent, encouraging us to kill her even, just so this betrayal can turn her into a Scarlet Valkyrie that will serve Melania.
It must be done by your hand, no other. Millicent trusts you, rather deeply in fact. Sever that trust. Nurtured by betrayal, her bud will flower most vividly. When Melania
Bruh.
ascends to godhood, Millicent too shall be reborn as a Scarlet Valkyrie.
If Millicent dies, she flowers, with Gowry's expectation being that she will be revived after this. So considering that there's a bloom in Melania's boss room as well that appears after you defeat her, I feel like it's possible that Melania could have another revivification
rebloom.
after this as well. And
Well, when it comes to the Scarlet Rot in the earlier parts of the video, we learned that there's also the process of rebirth as well. That's a part of it. So that logic tracks.
one final piece of evidence was actually pointed out by you guys in the comments of my recent Oracle short. In that video, I argued that the Oracles might be there to herald the return of Mikla as a god, as their spirit ashes state that it is said that when Oracle envoys appear playing their pipes, they do so to herald the arrival of a new god or age.
Oh, maybe we're suggesting that they were there in order to herald the coming of the Scarlet Goddess?
But I completely neglected to mention that they might be here to herald Melania's ascension as a god instead.
Yeah.
So thank you guys for pointing that out. If you haven't already, I'd appreciate if you tried out some of my shorts content. It's extremely difficult to fit everything within 60 seconds, but it's a fun challenge.
Oh, tell me about
I'm
it.
pretty happy with some of the short stories that I've been able to tell in those shorts. Anyway, personally, I wouldn't be surprised if we fight some incarnation of Melania again in the DLC, and I'd be down for that fight, provided she rises again with her lower half as a scorpion or something. But what I find to be the most disturbing thought about Melania's potential third bloom is that Gowrie believes a scarlet bloom will be more vivid if it's nurtured by betrayal. That's what we see in Millicent's questline.
Oh no. That's right. Are we potentially suggesting a betrayal from the person that she trusts the most? Miquella?
So what if Melania's third bloom could be more vivid if she's betrayed by her brother, Miquella?
Yeah.
But it's late now, and I'm really getting into some deranged speculation territory, aren't I? So that's probably my cue to end the video. A special thanks to Mispat for the footage and editing help, as always, and special thanks to Quelaag as well for looking over this script, and thank you, as always, for watching.
To be honest with you, after everything that Melania has been through, I don't think my heart could take a betrayal from Miquella. But I don't know, I guess we'll see. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll catch you in the next one.